Joining us now to discuss these latest developments coming out of Syria is Kervin Aucoin, former lead intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance coordinator for the U.S. Army in Europe, as well as the host of the This Week Explained podcast. Kervin, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now let's talk about what we just heard in the package there. Do you see a potentially dangerous power vacuum forming?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, let's let the Syrians be happy about this, but let's also understand that while Assad was a dangerous and authoritarian leader, there's a power vacuum now in another country in the Middle East which did not need this to happen. So what do we have here? You heard John Kirby talk about HTS. That's Hayat Tahrir, al-Sham. They're controlled by a guy Abu Mohammed Jalani. He was a al-Qaeda fighter. He has fought against U.S. forces in the Middle East. And then the same thing with ISIS fighters. There's thousands of ISIS fighters that are held prisoner in Syria. Are these new factions going to open up those prisons and release all those ISIS fighters so that we see a rise of ISIS again? These are all very dangerous circumstances when a dictator such as Assad gets thrown out or his power is done. We usually, what typically happens, especially in the recent history of our cultures, we don't see good things happen. You can go look to Libya when Gaddafi was murdered, executed. New regimes come in, and that did not do well for the Libyan people. Go look at Iraq when Saddam Hussein left. That left another power vacuum, and Al Qaeda took over with the support of Iran. So there's a ton to keep looking at, but we can still celebrate this. We can celebrate that Assad is gone, that the Syrian people are no longer under his control, but we have to keep focused on it because we cannot let this become another country that deteriorates like we've seen so many times in the past.
Kervin, I'm curious, how did this rebel uprising specifically overthrow Assad so quickly? I mean, the Syrian civil war, it's nothing new. It's been going on for 13 years. What made this uprising different?
Well, I think you nailed it right there. It's been going on for 13 years. The opposition forces have been reconsolidating, and they found an advantage with time. Through the passage of time, we can see that people are, especially within the Syrian forces, they're frustrated, they're tired, they're not getting support from Assad. But speaking of support, Russian support, that was what was really lacking during this movement with the opposition forces. So Russia is really making a push in Ukraine right now. They've really made their focus just before they have to go into peace negotiations with Ukraine. And so they kind of lost focus in Syria. And as the opposition began to move and they marched on Damascus, Russia said, "You're not going to get our support." Another bit of it that I think even the opposition forces were surprised at is Iran. Iran did not offer support as this was going on. They just said they'd see how it plays out. So with the passage of time, with people being just tired and war weary, and then not having the support from major powers like Russia and Iran, that led to where we are today.
Kervin, speaking of Iran not showing up to support Syria this time around, does that say something about their financial or military state right now?
Yeah, absolutely. They were focused with Israel, with Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Those Iranian proxies have been failing day in and day out since Hamas went in on October 7th of 2023. And so we're seeing Iran lose control in the Middle East. And they've gotten to a point where they can no longer support these proxy forces. And so they've started to, right now we're hearing that they are increasing their nuclear program because they're trying to figure something out to retain power in the Middle East. And I would tell everybody, if you're going to keep an eye on something in the Middle East right now, a new uprising, look for a new Iranian revolution. The Iranian people are going to look at Syria, they're going to look at Iraq, they're going to look at what Israel did with Lebanon and Palestine, and we could see this huge uprising within Iran that removes Khomeini and removes the president and allows the Iranian people to live freely.
Now, speaking of the Middle East, do you think that Israeli intelligence agencies and American agencies as well, were they aware of this happening? Were they surprised?
I can tell you, as far as U.S. intelligence, they were very surprised. Not that it happened, but the rate at which this occurred. Even a week into it, there were a lot of U.S. intelligence analysts who said that these forces would never get into Damascus. Assad is going to push back. He's got too much power in Syria, and he was not going to allow this to happen. That did not happen, and it just shows that sometimes the analysis is not correct. You've got to go back and see why that is, and I do think the intelligence community needs to do a much better job of understanding these skirmishes within the Middle East.
Kervin, let's talk more about U.S. involvement. I mean, we did hear Jake Sullivan say the U.S. wouldn't dive in militarily. Then CENTCOM announces yesterday strikes on ISIS in Syria. Trump said that this is not our fight. And you also mentioned the HTS, which led this offensive. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it is considered a terrorist group by the U.S. Are you expecting further U.S. involvement, or do you expect the U.S. to really just sit this one out?
Well, first, let me say you're absolutely right. HTS is a terrorist organization. It is designated by the United States as a terrorist organization, and it should remain a terrorist organization. It should remain labeled as a terrorist organization. I know Jelani says that he's changed and he's not going back to his Al-Qaeda roots, but actions speak louder than words, and we're going to see what he does from there. Now, as far as U.S. support, U.S. has been unfortunately using taxpayer dollars to fund all sides of this war. It's not even just two sides; it's all the sides. We've got Kurds in the north. The HTS has some funding from the United States. Even factions within the Assad regime, certain elements of the United States was funding that. I'd say we get all funding out of Syria, get it out of the Middle East, and let those entities decide how they want to rebuild their regime. The United States is historically not really good at building regimes, especially in the Middle East. For something that I say is utilizing Western values to try to manipulate Middle Eastern values. We in the U.S. we just don't do a very good job of that. So what I think is going to happen when Trump takes office in January, he will remove funding. Sorry about that. He's going to remove funding from there, and we'll be out of Syria. We'll see what happens there. But even though we're moving boots on the ground out of the Middle East or out of Syria, that doesn't mean our eyes need to look away. We do have interests in the region, and we cannot let it become a powder keg and completely blow up.
Kervin, last question for you here. We've been talking about Iran, we've been talking about Russia, but I think it's also important to note that another big supporter of these regimes is China, of course, right? And then we saw Assad visited China just a little over a year ago. The two regimes have these diplomatic ties. How do you see China reading the news coming out of Syria? And what do you think they're preparing for right now in terms of new powers coming into play?
That's a great question because China's been very quiet, at least publicly, throughout this entire ordeal. I think what we're seeing right now is China is pretty happy about what's happening because all eyes are focused on the Middle East, eyes are focused on Russia in Ukraine, and no one's really focused on what's happening in the maritime borders of China and Taiwan. Just today, Taipei sent out an alert that's the people of Taiwan to be very careful because China was making some naval moves close to the border there. Now we're not close to seeing China within, I'd say it's not in the next year that China's going to invade Taiwan to reintegrate that area back into China. But we need to keep a close eye because Xi Jinping is ready to go. He's just waiting for the right opportunity. And when all eyes are focused on everywhere else geopolitically, that's a perfect time for him to make a move.
Absolutely. So important to keep an eye. Kervin Aucoin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.